In the scorching Nevada desert at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, a 5'3" soldier was about to face the most brutal military training program in the country. What started as elite special forces close combat training took a shocking turn when she came face to face with soldiers twice her size who viewed her as nothing more than a diversity quota. Corporal Lena Vargas wasn't your typical military recruit. For years, she had spent her life dominating underground MMA circuits in East Los Angeles, known for dismantling opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. When she encountered Sergeant Marcus Hale's systematic campaign to break her spirit, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would define not just her career, but the future of military combat training. Lena's response, silent, methodical, and devastating, would lead to a complete transformation of how the military measured strength and effectiveness. What began as mockery and dismissal would become a masterclass in technique over power. The entire base would never be the same after a warrior who was supposed to fail instead redefined what it meant to be a soldier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a wasteland of scorched earth and stubborn scrub brush that seemed to mock the very concept of human survival. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt as the transport bus groaned to a halt outside the gates of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, its air conditioning unit wheezing like a dying animal. Through the dust-caked windows, Corporal Lena Vargas caught her first glimpse of what would either make or break her military career. The base sprawled across the desert floor like a metallic infection, all concrete barriers and razor wire, with prefabricated buildings that looked designed to withstand both sandstorms and artillery strikes. Beyond the perimeter, training areas marked by tire tracks and boot prints scarred the landscape, while obstacle courses rose from the hardpan like the skeletal remains of some massive beast. Lena shouldered her duffel bag and stepped off the bus, immediately hit by a wall of heat that felt like opening an oven door. At 5'3" and barely 120 pounds, she cut a slight figure against the imposing backdrop of the facility. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes took in every detail with the measured assessment of someone who had learned early that survival depended on reading a room correctly. The other recruits filing off the bus were exactly what she had expected. Towering specimens of military breeding, all broad shoulders and thick necks, moving with the casual confidence of men who had never doubted their place in the world. Their conversation filled the air with testosterone-fueled boasts about bench press records and previous combat assignments. "Jesus Christ, look at this place," muttered a massive soldier with arms like tree trunks, squinting against the desert glare. "They really think they're going to break us here?" "That's the idea, Tank," replied another recruit. This one lean but tall, with the kind of ropey muscle that spoke of endurance rather than power. "Only the best make it through." Lena recognized the type immediately. The big one, Tank apparently, was probably a former football player, used to dominating through size and strength. The tall one looked more tactical, analytical. Both would underestimate her. They always did. "Fall in, recruits." The voice cut through the desert air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Sergeant Marcus Hale emerged from the nearest building, his combat boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. Everything about him screamed career military. The perfectly pressed BDUs, the regulation haircut, the way he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had earned his rank through blood and sweat. His eyes swept across the assembled group with the clinical assessment of a predator cataloging prey. "Welcome to hell, ladies," Hale continued, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made smart people pay attention. "For the next 12 weeks, this desert is going to teach you things about yourselves you probably don't want to know. Some of you will discover you're tougher than you thought. Others will discover they're not nearly tough enough." His gaze lingered on Lena for a moment longer than the others, and she caught something in his expression that made her stomach tighten. Not just skepticism. She was used to that. This was something colder, more calculated. "But before we begin breaking you down and building you back up, let's get one thing straight. This is not your high school wrestling team. This is not your college boxing club. This is elite special forces close combat training, designed to produce soldiers who can kill with their bare hands when the situation demands it. The enemy doesn't care about your feelings, your background, or what diversity initiative got you assigned here." The words hit like a physical slap, and Lena felt every eye in the group turn toward her. She kept her expression neutral,
her posture correct, but inside she was already mapping the battlefield. This wasn't going to be about proving herself, it was going to be about surviving the hostility of her own unit long enough to demonstrate what she was capable of. "Sergeant, with respect," came a voice from behind her, and Lena turned to see a slight, wiry soldier with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. "Are we talking about actual combat effectiveness, or are we just here to play grab-ass in the sand?" Hale's smile was razor-thin. "Corporal Reyes, isn't it? Good question. We're here to find out which of you has what it takes when technique, speed, and mental toughness matter more than how much you can bench press." His eyes found Lena again. "Because I guarantee you, the enemy won't go easy on you just because you're small." "Neither will we," Tank added with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Hope you're tougher than you look, little lady." The comment drew chuckles from several of the other recruits, and Lena felt the familiar weight of being the outsider, the anomaly, the one who didn't belong. She had lived with it her entire life, first as the only girl in her father's boxing gym, then as the smallest fighter in underground MMA circuits, and now here, where her presence apparently represented everything wrong with modern military standards. "That's enough," came a new voice, crisp and authoritative. Lieutenant Amira Shah emerged from the administrative building, her bearing as precise as her uniform. She was small by military standards, maybe 5'6", but she moved with an economy of motion that suggested lethal competence. "Sergeant Hale, if you're done with the orientation speech, we have a schedule to keep." "Yes, ma'am," Hale replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with the interruption. "Recruits, you'll be assigned to barracks and given your training schedules. Chow is at 1800 hours. Training begins at 0500 tomorrow, and I suggest you get your beauty sleep. You're going to need it." As the group began to disperse, Lena caught Lieutenant Shaw watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not skepticism, more like careful assessment, as if Shaw were trying to solve a puzzle. The barracks were exactly what Lena had expected: Spartan, functional, and designed to strip away any illusions of comfort or privacy. She was assigned a bunk in a room with 7 other recruits, all of whom took up roughly twice as much space as she did. The conversation as they settled in was predictably focused on who could lift the most, who had the most combat experience, and who was going to wash out first. "My money's on the little one," Tank announced, not bothering to lower his voice as he unpacked his gear. "Nothing personal, but this isn't exactly designed for people your size." "Size isn't everything," Corporal Reyes commented quietly from his bunk across the room. "Some of the best fighters I've seen were smaller than you'd expect." "In a ring, maybe, but this is military training. When you're carrying a 100-pound pack through hostile territory, technique doesn't make up for a lack of muscle mass." Lena continued organizing her gear methodically, folding each item with military precision. She had learned long ago that the best response to doubt was not words, but performance. Let them think what they wanted. Tomorrow would begin the process of teaching them otherwise. "Besides," Tank continued, apparently enjoying his role as the voice of conventional wisdom, "I mean, what's the point of training someone for hand-to-hand combat if they're going to get overpowered by pretty much anyone they face?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Lena felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. This was the moment where she was supposed to prove herself with words, to justify her presence, to explain why she deserved to be there. Instead, she finished arranging her belongings and turned to face the room. "I guess we'll find out," she said, simply, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness they probably expected. "Should be interesting." The response seemed to deflate some of the tension, though Tank looked disappointed that she hadn't risen to the bait. Corporal Reyes caught my eye and nodded slightly. Approval, maybe, or just acknowledgement that she had handled the situation better than most would have. That night, as the desert cooled and the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, Lena lay in her narrow bunk and listened to the sounds of 20 soldiers trying to sleep. Some snored, others tossed and turned, and a few whispered conversations continued in the darkness. Through the small window above her head, she could see stars scattered across the Nevada sky like broken glass. She thought about her father's gym back in East Los Angeles, the smell of sweat and leather, the rhythm of gloves hitting heavy bags. She thought about the underground fights that had paid for her college education and taught her that winning wasn't always about being the strongest person in the room. Most of all, she thought about the accident that had driven her away from fighting and into the military, the moment when her opponent had hit the canvas wrong and everything changed. Tomorrow would begin the process of proving that she belonged here, but tonight she allowed herself a moment of doubt. Not about her abilities. She knew exactly what she was capable of. The doubt was about whether it would be enough to overcome not just the physical challenges ahead, but the psychological warfare that had already begun. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the razor wire, carrying with it the promise of heat and hardship, and the kind of trial by fire that either forged you into something stronger or left you broken in the sand. The alarm sounded at 0430 hours, a harsh electronic shriek that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a rusty knife. Lena was already awake, had been for 15 minutes, her internal clock as precise as any timepiece. Around her, the other recruits groaned and cursed their way into consciousness, stumbling through the ritual of getting dressed in the dark. "Rise and shine, sunshine," Tank muttered, his voice thick with sleep. "Time to find out who's got what it takes." The Nevada desert before dawn was surprisingly cold, the air sharp and thin as recruits filed out of the barracks in formation. Stars still dotted the sky, but on the eastern horizon, the faintest suggestion of light promised another scorching day ahead. Sergeant Hale waited for them outside the mess hall, looking as crisp and alert as if he had slept in his uniform. "Good morning, ladies," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the formation. "I hope you enjoyed your beauty sleep, because it's the last good night's rest you're going to get for the next 12 weeks. Today we find out what you're really made of." Breakfast was a hurried affair. Powdered eggs, lukewarm coffee, and toast that could have doubled as body armor. Lena ate methodically, fueling her body for the ordeal ahead while listening to the nervous chatter around her. Most of the recruits were trying to project confidence, but she could see the tension in their movements, the way they picked at their food or wolfed it down too quickly. "First exercise is orientation to the obstacle course," Hale announced as they finished eating. "But this isn't your standard boot camp playground. This course is designed to simulate the kind of physical and mental stress you'll face in real combat situations. The heat, the fatigue, the pressure, it's all here." The obstacle course sprawled across 2 acres of desert hardpan, a maze of walls, rope climbs, tire runs, and crawling pits that looked like it had been designed by someone with a sadistic imagination. The sun was already beginning to assert its authority, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and red that promised brutal heat within hours. "Full combat gear," Hale continued, gesturing toward a pile of packs, weapons, and equipment. 65 pounds minimum, plus weapon. You'll complete the course as a unit, but individual times will be recorded. Anyone who falls more than 2 standard deviations below the group average gets to run it again this evening when the temperature hits 110 degrees. Lena shouldered her pack, adjusted the straps, and checked her weapon. The weight was significant, but manageable. She had trained with heavier loads during her preparation for this assignment. Around her, the other recruits were going through similar preparations, though she noticed that several of them seemed surprised by the heft of the gear. "Jesus, this thing weighs more than my girlfriend," one of them muttered. "Your girlfriend must be pretty scrawny," Tank replied, though even he was breathing a little harder as he adjusted his pack straps. The first obstacle was a wall climb. 12 feet of rough plywood with minimal handholds, designed to test upper body strength and determination. Lena watched as the first few recruits attacked it with brute force, muscling their way up through sheer strength. Tank went up like a gorilla, all power and momentum, clearing the top with room to spare. When her turn came, Lena approached the wall differently. Instead of trying to overpower it, she studied the available handholds, planned her route, and moved with calculated precision. Her smaller hands could grip holds that the larger recruits couldn't use effectively, and her lower body weight meant she needed less upper body strength to pull herself up. She cleared the wall in the middle of the pack time-wise, but with far less apparent effort than those who had gone before. "Not bad for a lightweight," called out one of the other recruits, as she dropped down on the far side. The comment was probably meant as encouragement, but Lena heard the underlying assumption that she was performing better than expected for someone of her size, rather than simply performing well. The next obstacle was a rope climb over a water pit, 20 feet up to ring a bell and then back down. Here, the larger recruits' weight worked against them. Several struggled with the climb, their arms burning as they tried to haul their bulk up the rope. Lena went up smoothly, using her legs to take pressure off her arms, and was back on the ground before some of the others had reached the top. Tank finished his climb and dropped to the ground beside her, breathing heavily. "Okay, I'll admit it," he said between gasps. "You're not completely hopeless at this." The backhanded compliment was typical of what she had experienced throughout her military career, but Lena just nodded and moved toward the next obstacle. Words were cheap. Performance was what mattered. The tire run came next. 50 yards of car tires laid out in a zigzag pattern that had to be navigated while maintaining speed and balance. This was where agility and foot speed mattered more than power, and Lena moved through the course like a dancer, her small feet finding secure footing where larger boots might slip or stumble. By the time they reached the low crawl, 30 yards through sand and gravel under barbed wire, the sun was fully up and the temperature was climbing rapidly. The larger recruits were beginning to show signs of heat stress, their movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. Lena's smaller body mass gave her an advantage here. She generated less heat and had a better surface area to weight ratio for cooling. "How the hell is she not dying out there?" she heard one recruit mutter to another as they approached the final obstacle. "Maybe she's part lizard, desert adaptation." The final challenge was a combination obstacle, a rope bridge crossing followed immediately by a tire carry. The rope bridge was 30 feet long, suspended 8 feet above a pit filled with muddy water. The tires were truck tires, heavy and awkward, that had to be carried 50 yards to a finishing line. Lena crossed the rope bridge with the confidence of someone who had learned early that balance was more important than strength. She had spent countless hours in her father's gym working on agility drills, and the skills translated perfectly to the swaying rope and shifting handholds. The tire carry was more challenging. The tires were designed to be difficult for anyone to manage, but they were proportionally harder for smaller soldiers. Lena adapted by changing her carrying technique, using her back and legs rather than trying to muscle the tire with her arms. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. When she crossed the finish line, she was surprised to discover that her overall time put her in the upper third of the group. Several of the larger recruits were still struggling with the tire carry, their faces red with exertion and heat stress. Sergeant Hale was waiting at the finish line with a stopwatch and a clipboard, marking times and making notes. When he saw Lena's time, his eyebrows rose slightly. Not approval exactly, but perhaps a recognition that she had performed better than expected. "Interesting," he said, more to himself than to her. As the last recruits finished the course, Hale gathered the group for the after-action review. The sun was now fully asserting its dominance, and the temperature was climbing toward the brutal heights that would characterize the rest of the day. "First run times," he announced, consulting his clipboard. "Overall, about what I expected. Some of you performed better than your files suggested you would. Others," he let the statement hang, "others have some work to do." His eyes found Lena in the group. "Vargas, step forward." Lena's heart sunk. This was it, the moment where her performance would be dismissed or explained away, where her success would be attributed to luck or some kind of accommodation made for her size. "Yes, Sergeant."
"Your time was impressive," Hale said, his voice carrying across the assembled recruits. "Upper third of the group, despite being the smallest soldier here by a significant margin." The statement hung in the desert air like a challenge. Lena wasn't sure if it was praise or the setup for some kind of humiliation. "However," Hale continued, and there it was, the word she had been expecting. "Obstacle courses are one thing. Combat is another. Size and strength matter when you're fighting for your life, not just racing against a clock." He gestured toward Tank, who stepped forward with a grin that suggested he knew what was coming. "Donnelly, wrestling drill. Basic takedown and control. Let's see how technique holds up against good old-fashioned muscle." The other recruits formed a loose circle as Lena and Tank squared off on a sandy patch of ground that served as an impromptu wrestling mat. Tank was grinning with the confidence of someone who had never lost a test of strength, his massive frame casting a shadow across Lena's smaller form.
"Nothing personal," Tank said as they faced each other, "but this is going to be over pretty quick." Lena nodded, settling into a fighting stance that drew from her years of mixed martial arts training. Tank's approach would be straightforward, use his size and strength to overpower her, probably going for a takedown that would put her on the ground where his weight advantage would be decisive. "Begin," Hale called out. Tank lunged forward with the kind of bull rush that had probably worked for him in high school and college football. It was exactly what Lena had expected, powerful, direct, and completely lacking in finesse. She sidestepped at the last moment, using his momentum against him, and Tank crashed into the sand where she had been standing. The circle of recruits erupted in surprised laughter, though Tank was back on his feet quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment rather than exertion. "Lucky," he muttered, resetting his stance. This time he approached more cautiously, trying to use his reach advantage to grab her before she could evade. Lena stayed light on her feet, moving in and out of range, making him work for every opportunity. When he finally committed to another takedown attempt, she was ready. As Tank reached for her, Lena dropped her center of gravity and slipped under his grasping arms. She hooked her leg behind him, grabbed his wrist, and used a basic judo throw to send him crashing to the ground again. This time, she followed him down, securing a position that would have allowed her to control the fight if this had been real combat. The laughter died away, replaced by stunned silence. Tank lay on his back in the sand, looking up at Lena with an expression of complete bewilderment. "What the hell just happened?" he asked. Sergeant Hale's expression was unreadable as he looked down at the two soldiers. "What happened, Donnelly, is that you just got schooled by someone half your size. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the group how that was possible." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Tank sat up, brushing sand from his uniform. His earlier cockiness had evaporated, replaced by genuine confusion. I don't know, Sergeant. She's faster than I expected." "Speed is part of it, but there's something else. Anyone want to take a guess?" Corporal Reyes raised his hand. "Technique, Sergeant. She knew what he was going to do before he did it." "Exactly," Hale confirmed. "Vargas read Donnelly's intentions, used his momentum against him, and executed a textbook throw. Size and strength are important, but they're not everything." Lena helped Tank to his feet, and was surprised when he shook her hand with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Damn," he said quietly. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Long story," Lena replied. As the group prepared to move on to the next training exercise, Lena caught Lieutenant Shaw watching from the sidelines. The older woman nodded slightly, approval, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that something important had just happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur of heat, exhaustion, and increasingly difficult training exercises. But something had shifted in the group dynamic. The easy dismissal of Lena's capabilities had been replaced by a more cautious respect, although she could tell that for some, the change was reluctant at best. The Nevada sun was at its most merciless at 1400 hours, turning the desert training ground into a furnace that tested the limits of human endurance. Heat waves shimmered off the concrete pad where the recruits had assembled for hand-to-hand combat evaluations, and even the most hardened soldiers were showing signs of strain. Lena stood in formation with the others, her uniform already soaked with sweat despite her body's efficient cooling system. Sergeant Hale emerged from the administrative building carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Behind him walked Lieutenant Shah, her bearing as precise as always, though she noticed she was staying in the shade cast by the building's overhang. "Combat evaluations," Hale announced, his voice cutting through the desert air like a knife. "This is where we separate the fighters from the pretenders. Each of you will face off against another recruit in a controlled combat scenario. Rules are simple: submission, knockout, or referee stoppage. Medical personnel are standing by." He gestured toward a corner of the training area where Doc Simmons and his medical team had set up a field aid station, complete with ice packs, smelling salts, and what looked like a stretcher. "The evaluations serve multiple purposes," Hale continued, beginning to pace in front of the assembled recruits. "First, they establish a baseline of your current combat capabilities. Second, they determine combat partner assignments for the remainder of the training cycle. And third," he paused, his eyes scanning the group, "they weed out anyone who doesn't have the mental fortitude for close-quarters combat." Lena felt a familiar tightness in her stomach, the pre-fight anxiety that had accompanied her into every underground MMA bout she had ever fought. The difference was that those fights had been voluntary, chosen battles where she could prepare for specific opponents. This was different. This was designed to test her under conditions she couldn't control. "First match," Hale called out, consulting his clipboard. "Morrison versus Jackson." The two recruits stepped forward, both large, both confident, both eager to prove themselves in front of their peers. The fight was brief and brutal, ending when Morrison managed to secure a chokehold that forced Jackson to tap out. Both men were breathing heavily as they returned to the group, but they were grinning with the satisfaction of soldiers who had proven their courage. "Good aggression from both fighters," Hale commented, making notes on his clipboard. "Morrison, you'll be paired with Jackson for combat training. Learn from each other." The pattern continued through several matches, each one reinforcing the same basic dynamic: size, strength, and aggression determining the outcome. Lena watched carefully, studying fighting styles and techniques, looking for weaknesses she could exploit if and when her turn came. Tank faced off against a wiry recruit named Patterson and ended the fight quickly with a takedown that looked more like a controlled demolition than a wrestling maneuver. Patterson tapped out before serious injury could occur, but Lena could see the pain in his face as Doc Simmons checked him for injuries. "Donnelly," Hale called out as Tank returned to the group. "Decent technique, but you're relying too much on strength. What happens when you face someone who can neutralize your size advantage?" Tank glanced toward Lena, a flicker of memory crossing his features. "Work on technique, Sergeant. Speed and leverage." "Exactly. Remember that." As the matches continued, Lena began to notice a pattern in Hale's selections. He wasn't choosing opponents randomly. He was carefully orchestrating matchups that would reveal specific strengths and weaknesses. And she was beginning to suspect that her opponent had been chosen very carefully indeed. "Vargas," Hale called out, and Lena felt every eye in the group turn toward her. "Step forward." She moved to the center of the training area, her movements calm and controlled, despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. The concrete was hot enough to feel through her boots, and the sun was like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. "Your opponent," Hale continued, "Corporal Dwyer." Lena's heart sank. Ray Dwyer was one of the most aggressive fighters in the unit, a former amateur boxer who had joined the military after a brief and unsuccessful professional career. He was 6'2", heavily muscled, and had the kind of scarred knuckles that spoke of experience in bars and back alleys. More importantly, he had made no secret of his opinion that women had no place in combat units.
Dwyer stepped forward with a grin that was all teeth and malice. "Well, well," he said loud enough for the entire group to hear. "Looks like Christmas came early." "This is a controlled exercise," Lieutenant Shaw called out from the sidelines. "Any unnecessary roughness will result in immediate disciplinary action." Dwyer's grin widened. "Of course, ma'am. Wouldn't want to hurt anyone." The two fighters faced each other on the concrete pad, and Lena could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her like the desert heat. Everyone was watching, not just to see how she would perform, but to see if she would break under pressure. This wasn't just a combat evaluation, it was a test of her right to be there. "Fighters ready?" Hale asked. Lena nodded, settling into a fighting stance that drew from her years of mixed martial arts training. Dwyer bounced on the balls of his feet, his hands already clenched into fists, clearly intending to end the fight as quickly and decisively as possible. "Begin." Dwyer came at her like a freight train, throwing a combination of punches that would have flattened most opponents. But Lena had fought bigger, stronger opponents before, and she knew that the key to surviving the early assault was movement and distance management. She slipped the first punch, ducked under the second, and danced away from the third, staying just outside the range of Dwyer's longer reach. His early aggression was impressive, but wasteful. He was burning energy at an unsustainable rate, especially in the desert heat. "Stand still and fight," Dwyer snarled, pressing forward with another combination. This time, Lena didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped inside his guard, too close for his longer punches to be effective, and drove an elbow toward his ribs. Dwyer managed to block it, but the impact staggered him slightly, creating an opening. Lena took advantage immediately, dropping her level and shooting for a takedown. Dwyer's boxing background hadn't prepared him for grappling, and he went down hard, with Lena controlling his descent and landing in a dominant position. On the ground, size mattered less. Lena had spent years learning to fight from her back, to use her flexibility and technical knowledge to overcome opponents that weighed her by 50 pounds or more. Dwyer was strong, but he was also exhausted from his early burst of aggression, and he was fighting in an unfamiliar element.
She secured an arm, slipped her leg across his throat, and began to apply pressure. The triangle choke was one of her favorite submissions. It was difficult to counter if applied correctly, and it got tighter the more the opponent struggled. Dwyer's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. He tried to power out of the hold, using his superior strength to lift Lena off the ground, but she had anticipated the response and adjusted her position to maintain control. The more he struggled, the tighter the choke became. "Tap," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "It's not worth getting choked unconscious." For a moment, Dwyer's pride warred with his survival instinct. His face was turning red, and his struggles were becoming increasingly desperate. Finally, reluctantly, he tapped her leg 3 times, the universal signal of submission. Lena released the hold immediately and helped him to his feet. Dwyer stood unsteadily, his hands going to his throat, looking at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 hardened soldiers stood in stunned quiet, processing what they had just witnessed. Tank's mouth was hanging open. Corporal Reyes was nodding slowly, as if something had just been confirmed for him. Even Sergeant Hale looked surprised. "Well," Hale said finally, breaking the silence, "that was unexpected." He made notes on his clipboard, though he could see his hand was less steady than usual. "Clean submission, good technique, excellent distance management. Dwyer, you fought like you were in a bar brawl instead of a tactical combat situation. Size and aggression aren't enough if you can't adapt to your opponent's strategy." Dwyer was still staring at Lena, shaking his head slowly. How did you do that?" "Training," Lena replied simply. "What kind of training?" Tank called out from the group, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Lena hesitated. She had hoped to keep her background quiet, to be judged on her military performance rather than her past. But the question was out there now, and she could see in their faces that they deserved an answer. "Mixed martial arts," she said finally.
I fought competitively before joining the military. The revelation rippled through the group like a stone dropped in still water. Suddenly, her performance made sense, not as a fluke or an accident, but as the result of years of dedicated training and competition. Underground circuit? Corporal Reyes asked, his analytical mind already working through the implications. Something like that. Sergeant Hale was studying her with a new expression, one that combined respect with something that might have been concern. How competitively? Competitively enough. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all she was prepared to share. The underground MMA scene in Los Angeles had been brutal and unforgiving, a world where technique mattered more than credentials, and where losing meant going home with empty pockets and new scars. She had been one of the best, feared by opponents twice her size, until the accident that had driven her away from fighting and into the military. "Well," Hale said, making more notes on his clipboard, "this certainly changes things. Vargas, you will be paired with Dwyer for combat training. He needs to learn technique. You need to learn to work with a partner. Consider it a mutual education." Dwyer nodded slowly, still rubbing his throat. "Yes, Sergeant, I think I can learn a lot from her." As the group prepared to move on to the next phase of training, Lena felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Tank looking at her with an expression of newfound respect. "Damn," he said quietly, "I was way off about you." "It happens," Lena replied. "Yeah, but—" Tank paused, searching for the right words. "I mean, I thought you were here because of some diversity thing. Quota filling or whatever. But you're actually good at this." The comment was typical of what she had experienced throughout her military career, surprised that she was competent, as if her size and gender made skill impossible rather than merely unexpected. But there was something different in Tank's tone now, a genuine recognition that she belonged there. "We all are. That's why we're here." As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red, Lena walked back toward the barracks with the rest of the group. The conversation around her had changed. Instead of dismissive comments about her size, she heard tactical discussions about her technique, questions about her training methods, and the kind of respectful curiosity that was reserved for soldiers who had proven themselves under fire. It was a small victory, but an important one. She had established herself as more than just the anomaly in the unit, more than just the diversity hire who was expected to wash out during the first week. She was now a fighter who had earned her place through performance rather than policy. But even as she savored the small triumph, Lena knew that this was just the beginning. Sergeant Hale's expression during her fight had been unreadable, and she suspected that her demonstration of skill had created as many problems as it had solved. In a unit where hierarchy and traditional notions of strength mattered, being too good too quickly could be dangerous. The desert wind picked up as evening approached, carrying with it the promise of another scorching day to come. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that spoke of survival in harsh places, of adaptation and perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. Lena smiled slightly as she listened to the sound. She understood the sentiment perfectly. The desert nights were deceptively peaceful, the scorching heat giving way to an almost pleasant coolness that made outdoor training bearable. It was during these quiet hours after evening chow that Lena found herself alone on the practice mats, working through combinations and drills while the rest of the unit either slept or engaged in the traditional soldier pastimes of complaining and card games. She moved through her routine methodically, shadowboxing, footwork drills, grappling sequences against imaginary opponents. The familiar motions helped quiet her mind and prepare her body for whatever challenges Sergeant Hale would devise the next day. After her victory over Dwyer, she knew that the real test was just beginning. "You're up late." Lena turned to find Corporal Reyes approaching from the direction of the barracks, his slight frame silhouetted against the security lights. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that survival often depended on being observant rather than obvious. "Couldn't sleep. The desert takes some getting used to. Mind if I watch? I'm trying to figure out how you made Dwyer look like an amateur." Lena paused, studying his face in the dim light. Ethan Reyes had been quietly supportive since her arrival, never joining in the mockery, but never openly defending her either. He was the kind of soldier who analyzed situations before committing to a position. "It's not magic," she said finally. "Just pattern recognition and leverage." "Show me." For the next hour, Lena walked Ethan through the basics of reading an opponent's body language, identifying telegraphed attacks and using momentum against strength. He was a quick learner, his analytical mind absorbing the concepts faster than most. You watch them like you're studying blueprints. Most fighters just react. You're planning 3 moves ahead. "That's what kept me alive in the underground circuit," Lena admitted. "When you're giving up 50 pounds to every opponent, you better know what they're going to do before they do." "Speaking of opponents," Ethan said, lowering his voice, "you should know that Hale's been asking questions about your background. Wants to know how someone with your record ended up in a combat unit." Lena felt a familiar chill despite the desert warmth. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests that he thinks there's something suspicious about your assignment here. He's been talking to people, implying that your win against Dwyer was more luck than skill." "And what do you think?" Ethan smiled. "I think anyone who calls that lucky doesn't understand the first thing about fighting. But Hale's got influence, and he's not happy about being wrong." The next morning brought another brutal training session, this one focused on ground combat in desert conditions. The sand got into everything: uniforms, weapons, mouths. And the heat was relentless even before noon. Lena found herself paired with different partners throughout the day, each one testing her skills from a different angle. During a particularly intense grappling drill, she took an elbow to the ribs that left her gasping, and Tank accidentally caught her with a knee that would leave a spectacular bruise. By the time Doc Simmons called for medical break, she was moving more carefully than usual. "Let me take a look at that," Doc said, guiding her toward the medical station. He was a compact man in his 40s with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen everything the military could dish out. His hands were gentle but efficient as he examined her ribs. "Nothing broken, but you're going to be sore for a few days. Ice tonight, heat tomorrow, and try not to let the big boys use you as a tackling dummy." "They're just testing limits," Lena replied. "Same as anyone would." Doc raised an eyebrow. "Maybe, but there's testing limits and there's trying to break something that threatens your worldview. You've got some of these boys confused about what makes a soldier effective." He handed her an ice pack and lowered his voice. "Word of advice from someone who's catched up fighters for 20 years? Sometimes the hardest part isn't winning the fight. It's surviving what comes after the victory." That evening, as Lena applied ice to her bruised ribs, she noticed Tank approaching the medical area. He'd been watching her training sessions with increasing frequency, though he usually maintained his distance. "You okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I'll live. Occupational hazard." Tank nodded, then hesitated, as if weighing his words. "I've been thinking about what you did to Dwyer. That chokehold. Where'd you learn something like that?" "Brazilian jiu-jitsu mostly. Some judo. You pick things up when you're small enough that everyone wants to test you." Would you be willing to show me some of that stuff? I'm pretty good with the power game, but I've never learned much technique." Lena studied his face, looking for signs of mockery or hidden agenda. She found only curiosity and what appeared to be genuine respect. "Sure," she said finally. "But it'll take time. Technique doesn't come overnight. I've got time, and after watching you work, I figure I've got a lot to learn." The announcement came during morning formation, Sergeant Hale's voice cutting through the desert air with the precision of a blade. "Combat assessments continue today. We're going to see how our techniques hold up under pressure." Lena felt the familiar pre-fight tension settle in her stomach as Hale consulted his clipboard. She had been expecting this. After her victory over Dwyer, it was inevitable that Hale would escalate the challenges. "Today's featured match," Hale continued, his eyes finding Lena in the formation. "Vargas versus Donnelly. Let's see if size really doesn't matter." The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled recruits. Tank's match against Lena had been anticipated since her victory over Dwyer, and everyone knew this would be a more significant test. Tank had 40 pounds and 6 inches on her, plus the kind of natural athleticism that had made him a college football standout.
"Should be interesting," Tank said quietly as they prepared for the bout. "I've been thinking about what you showed me, but thinking and doing are two different things." The fighting area had been expanded for the occasion, and Lieutenant Shaw was present as an observer, her expression carefully neutral. Doc Simmons had positioned his medical team closer than usual, suggesting that someone expected this fight to be more intense than the previous matches. As they faced off on the mat, Lena could see the difference in Tank's approach. Gone was the overconfident swagger he had displayed during their first encounter. He moved more carefully now, his stance suggesting that he had at least tried to incorporate some of the techniques she had shown him. "Fighters ready?" Hale called out. Tank nodded, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. His size was imposing in the desert sun, casting a long shadow across the mat. But Lena had fought bigger opponents before, and she knew that size could be as much a disadvantage as an asset if properly exploited. "Begin." This time, Tank didn't charge. Instead, he approached methodically, trying to use his reach advantage to control distance. It was a smarter strategy than his previous bull rush, but it also played into Lena's strengths. The longer the fight went, the more her conditioning and technical knowledge would matter. They circled each other for several seconds, each looking for an opening. Tank threw a few probing jabs, testing her reactions, while Lena stayed mobile, making him work to close distance. When the engagement finally came, it was Tank who initiated, shooting for a takedown with better technique than he had shown before. But Lena had been expecting it, and she sprawled expertly, denying him the leverage he needed while creating an opportunity for a counterattack. She slipped around to his back as he recovered, securing a grip on his neck and looking for a rear naked choke. Tank's size allowed him to power out of the initial attempt, but the effort cost him energy and positioned him exactly where Lena wanted him. As Tank turned to face her, Lena dropped levels and executed a perfectly timed ankle pick, using his momentum and weight against him. He went down hard, and this time she was ready with a follow-up that he couldn't muscle his way out of. The submission came quickly, an arm triangle that tightened as Tank struggled against it. His superior strength meant nothing when the leverage was working against him, and his inexperience with ground fighting left him without effective counters. "Tap," Lena said quietly, applying steady pressure. For a moment, Tank's pride warred with pragmatism. Then, reluctantly, he tapped her shoulder 3 times. The reaction from the assembled recruits was markedly different this time. Instead of stunned silence, there were cheers and applause. Several soldiers called out congratulations, and even some of her former critics were nodding with approval. Tank sat up slowly, shaking his head with what appeared to be genuine amazement. "Damn, that was beautiful. I mean, you're twice my size and you made it look easy." He stood and extended his hand, which Lena shook gratefully. "No shame in losing to technique like that. I've got a lot to learn." Sergeant Hale's expression was unreadable as he made notes on his clipboard. "Interesting technique, Vargas. Very, unconventional." The King of the Ring exercise was designed to be brutal. Consecutive opponents with minimal rest between fights, testing both physical conditioning and mental resilience under extreme fatigue. Hale had positioned it as a special challenge, open to volunteers who wanted to prove their toughness. Lena had volunteered immediately, knowing that backing down would undo all the respect she had earned. Now, facing her 3rd consecutive opponent, with sweat stinging her eyes and her legs feeling like rubber, she was beginning to wonder if pride had overcome judgment. The first 2 fights had gone well, technical victories that showcased her grappling skills without requiring excessive energy expenditure. But opponent number 3 was Patterson, the wiry fighter who had given Tank trouble, and he was fresh while she was operating on fumes. Patterson came at her aggressively, sensing her fatigue and looking to end the fight quickly.
His striking was crisp and accurate, forcing her to work harder on defense than she had in the previous matches. When he caught her with a solid body shot, she felt her knees buckle slightly. From the sidelines, she caught Ethan's eye. He made a subtle gesture, a hand signal they had worked out during their training sessions that indicated Patterson's tendency to drop his left hand after throwing combinations. The information was exactly what Lena needed. She weathered Patterson's next attack, waited for the telltale drop of his guard, and countered with a perfectly timed takedown that caught him completely off balance. On the ground, her superior grappling skills took over, and she secured a submission within seconds. The last fighter was Morrison, the soldier who had won the opening match of the evaluation series. He was bigger than Patterson, but not as technical, relying on power and aggression to overwhelm opponents. Lena's body was screaming for rest, but her mind was clear. This was the moment that would define how the unit saw her, not as someone who could win a single fight, but as a warrior who could perform under extreme duress. Morrison rushed her immediately, sensing her exhaustion and looking for a quick finish. But Lena had been here before, in underground fights where money and reputation were on the line, and she knew how to find strength when her body had nothing left to give. She weathered his initial assault, used his aggression against him, and secured a submission hold that ended the exercise with a definitive statement about her capabilities. The cheers from her fellow soldiers were genuine now, no longer tinged with surprise, but filled with the kind of respect reserved for warriors who had proven themselves under fire. The summons to Major Kincaid's office came 3 days after the King of the Ring exercise, delivered by a stone-faced MP who offered no explanation beyond, "The Major wants to see you at 1400 hours." Lena reported as ordered, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Kincaid's office was spartanly furnished, all regulation furniture and motivational posters that looked like they had been issued by the same committee that designed military food. "Corporal Vargas," Major Kincaid said without preamble, "I've been reviewing your training reports, and I have some concerns." He opened a file folder and consulted several documents. Sergeant Hale has documented multiple instances of what he characterizes as reckless endangerment during combat exercises, excessive use of force, failure to follow safety protocols, prioritizing personal glory over unit cohesion. Lena felt ice form in her stomach. "Sir, I believe there may be some misunderstanding. Are you questioning Sergeant Hale's professional assessment?" Kincaid's voice carried the kind of authority that ended conversations. "Sir, no sir, but I would respectfully request that my performance be evaluated based on measurable results rather than subjective interpretation." The door opened behind her, and Lieutenant Shaw entered. "Major, I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there may be additional context relevant to this discussion." Kincaid's eyebrows rose. "Lieutenant?" "Corporal Vargas has consistently demonstrated superior technical skill, exceptional conditioning, and precisely the kind of adaptability we're trying to develop in this program. Her victory record speaks for itself, and her willingness to face consecutive opponents showed exactly the kind of mental toughness we need." Sergeant Hale seems to disagree. "Sergeant Hale is an excellent soldier, but he may have difficulty accepting that combat effectiveness can come in different packages than he's used to." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Kincaid closed the file folder. "Corporal, you're walking a fine line here. Excellence is expected, but so is discipline and unit cohesion. I'll be watching your performance closely. Dismissed." As they left the office, Shaw spoke quietly. "Be careful, Corporal. You've proven your point, but proving it too well can create its own problems." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." But as Lena walked back toward the training areas, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. The announcement came during morning formation, delivered with the kind of military precision that suggested this was more than just another training exercise.
Major Kincaid himself stood before the assembled units, his voice carrying across the desert training ground with unmistakable authority. "Base-wide hand-to-hand combat tournament," he announced, consulting a document that looked official enough to have come from much higher up the chain of command. "Open to all qualified personnel, with observers from Fort Bragg, Quantico, and Special Operations Command. This is an opportunity to showcase the caliber of soldiers we're producing here at Sentinel." Lena felt a familiar tightness in her stomach, the pre-competition anxiety that had accompanied her into every significant fight of her career. But this was different from the underground circuits or even the unit evaluations. This was official, sanctioned, and carried implications that extended far beyond personal reputation. The tournament brackets will be posted this afternoon. Medical personnel will be on standby, and all standard safety protocols will be observed. That said, this is combat training, not a sparring exhibition. Participants should expect to be tested to their limits. As the formation dispersed, Lena caught Lieutenant Shaw's eye. The older woman nodded slightly, not encouragement exactly, but acknowledgement that something significant was about to unfold. The tournament brackets revealed a field of 32 fighters drawn from across the base, including several she didn't recognize from other units. Tank was in the opposite bracket, which meant they wouldn't face each other unless they both made it to the semifinals. Ethan had also entered, though he was matched against a heavyweight in the first round that would likely end his tournament quickly.
"Nervous?" Doc Simmons asked as he checked her hands and wrists during the pre-tournament medical evaluation. "Always," Lena admitted, "but good nervous, the kind that keeps you sharp." "Well, you've certainly got people's attention. Word is that some of the observers came specifically to see if the stories about you were true." The first round was held in the base gymnasium, bleachers packed with off-duty personnel and visiting officials. Lena's opponent was a staff sergeant from the logistics unit, bigger than her but lacking any obvious technical training. The fight ended quickly, with a textbook armbar that demonstrated precision without unnecessary violence. As she walked back to the staging area, she passed Ethan being helped off the mat by Doc Simmons, a spectacular bruise already forming around his left eye. He managed a rueful grin as she approached. "Made it about 30 seconds longer than I expected," he said. "But I got some good intelligence on your potential opponents. The guy in bracket 7 has no ground game, and the heavyweight from Motorpool telegraphs his takedown attempts." The second round brought a more challenging opponent, a military police officer with obvious boxing experience and the kind of confident aggression that suggested he had won fights before. But boxing was only one dimension of combat, and when Lena took the fight to the ground, her striking skills became irrelevant. The submission came via rear naked choke, applied with the kind of technical precision that drew appreciative nods from the observers. As she helped her opponent to his feet, she noticed one of the visiting officials making notes on a clipboard. "Quarters tomorrow," Tank said as they left the gymnasium together. He had advanced through his bracket with the kind of decisive victories that his size and strength made possible. "You ready for this to get serious?" "It's been serious since day one. Tomorrow just makes it official." The quarterfinal round was held outdoors on the desert training ground, giving the competition a gladiatorial atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the stakes involved. Lena's opponent was a Special Forces sergeant with a reputation for unconventional tactics and the kind of wiry strength that spoke of years in combat zones. The fight was longer and more technical than her previous matches, with both fighters demonstrating advanced grappling skills and tactical awareness. When the submission finally came, a rear naked choke applied with the kind of technical precision that drew appreciative nods from the observers, she helped her opponent to his feet. She noticed one of the visiting officials making notes on a clipboard. "Impressive," Lieutenant Shaw commented as Lena left the fighting area. "You're adapting to each opponent's style instead of just imposing your own. That's championship-level thinking." The semifinal drew even larger crowds, with personnel from across the base gathering to watch what many considered the real test of the tournament.
Lena's opponent was Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a nationally ranked military grappler whose reputation extended far beyond the base. Rodriguez was everything his reputation suggested: technically sound, physically powerful, and possessed of the kind of ring intelligence that came from years of high-level competition. For the first time in the tournament, Lena found herself in a fight where her opponent matched her skill level while maintaining significant physical advantages. The match went the full time limit, with both fighters demonstrating techniques that drew appreciative murmurs from the observers. Rodriguez controlled much of the early action, using his superior strength to dictate position and pace. But as the fight progressed, Lena's conditioning and adaptability began to tell. In the final seconds, she caught Rodriguez overcommitting to a takedown attempt and countered with a perfectly timed throw that put him on his back. The submission that followed was so swift and decisive that the crowd erupted before the referee could even signal the end of the match. As Rodriguez tapped out, he looked up at Lena with an expression of genuine respect and said, "Where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" as she helped him to his feet. She simply replied, "East LA." The announcement that she had advanced to the final was met with sustained applause, but Lena barely heard it. Her attention was focused on the other semifinal, where Sergeant Hale was systematically dismantling his opponent with the kind of brutal efficiency that reminded everyone why he held his position. When Hale's hand was raised in victory, his eyes found Lena's across the fighting area. The message in his gaze was unmistakable. This had been inevitable from the moment she arrived at the base. The final was scheduled for the following evening, giving both fighters a day to recover and prepare. Lena spent the time quietly, reviewing video of Hale's previous fights with Ethan and working through scenarios with Tank, who had become surprisingly insightful about tactical analysis.
"He's going to try to overwhelm you early," Tank observed, studying footage of Hale's semifinal victory. "Classic intimidation tactic. Make you think you're outclassed before the real fighting even starts." "He's not wrong about the strength difference," Lena admitted. "He's bigger than anyone I faced in this tournament, and he's got legitimate technique to go with it." "But he's also got an ego," Ethan added, looking up from his laptop where he had been analyzing fight statistics. "Every one of his victories has come from imposing his will early. He's never been in a long fight where he had to adapt or overcome adversity." The final was held under portable lights on the main training ground, with bleachers erected for the occasion and what appeared to be half the base in attendance. The visiting observers occupied a special section, their clipboards and cameras suggesting that this fight would be documented and analyzed far beyond the base's borders. As Lena walked toward the fighting area, she caught sight of Major Kincaid in conversation with a colonel she didn't recognize. Both men were watching her with expressions that suggested the outcome of this fight would have implications reaching well beyond personal reputation. Hale was already waiting in the center of the mat, looking every inch the dominant predator he had proven himself to be throughout the tournament. His warm-up routine was designed for intimidation as much as preparation, powerful strikes that cut through the desert air with audible force. "Last chance to back out gracefully," he said as they faced each other for the referee's instructions. "No shame in recognizing when you're outclassed." "Thanks for the advice," Lena replied, her voice carrying none of the deference he expected. "I'll keep it in mind." The opening moments of the fight confirmed everyone's expectations. Hale came forward aggressively, using his reach and power advantage to control distance and dictate the pace. His striking was crisp and powerful, forcing Lena to focus entirely on defense, while looking for opportunities to counter. A solid body shot staggered her, and the follow-up combination nearly ended the fight before it had really begun. Only her superior footwork and ring intelligence kept her upright as Hale pressed his advantage with the confidence of someone who had seen this scenario play out dozens of times before. "Come on, Vargas!" Tank's voice cut through the crowd noise. "Make him work for it!" The encouragement from her former tormentor was surreal, but it also reminded Lena that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Every soldier who had ever been dismissed because of size or gender was invested in this outcome. As the fight progressed, Hale's early aggression began to cost him. The desert heat and his own adrenaline dump were taking a toll, and his combinations became slightly less crisp, his footwork marginally less precise. More importantly, his confidence was making him careless. Lena had been waiting for exactly this moment, the point where power began to give way to fatigue and arrogance created openings that technique could exploit. When Hale overcommitted to a takedown attempt, she was ready. The counter came in the form of a perfectly executed hip toss that used Hale's momentum and weight against him. The impact as he hit the mat was audible throughout the crowd, and for the first time in the fight, Lena was in control. On the ground, size mattered less. Hale was strong, but he was also exhausted and fighting in an unfamiliar position. When Lena secured the arm triangle, applying pressure with the kind of technical precision that had made her reputation, the outcome was no longer in doubt. "Tap," she said quietly, her voice audible only to Hale and the referee. For a long moment, Hale's pride warred with reality. His face was turning red, his struggles becoming increasingly desperate. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he tapped her shoulder 3 times. The crowd erupted as Lena released the hold and helped Hale to his feet. The applause was sustained and genuine, the kind of recognition reserved for performances that transcended sport and became something approaching art. Hale stood unsteadily, his hand going to his throat, looking at Lena with an expression that combined bewilderment with grudging respect. "How?" he asked simply. "Technique," she replied, extending her hand. "And maybe a little luck." He shook her hand, the gesture carrying more weight than any official ceremony could have provided. "No," he said loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "No luck involved. That was the best fighting I've ever seen." 6 weeks later, Lena stood in Major Kincaid's office, but the atmosphere was dramatically different from her previous visit. The walls now displayed photographs from the tournament, including one of her executing the throw that had ended the final bout. More importantly, Kincaid's expression held none of the skepticism that had characterized their earlier interaction.
"Corporal Vargas," he began, consulting a document that bore official letterhead. Or, should I say, Specialist Vargas. "Your promotion has been approved, along with your new assignment as an instructor in the Close Combat Training Program." The promotion was unexpected, but welcome. More significant was the implication that her methods were being officially recognized and incorporated into the base's training curriculum. "Lieutenant Shaw will be overseeing the curriculum development," Kincaid continued, "but you'll be responsible for hands-on instruction in advanced grappling techniques and tactical adaptation. We want other soldiers to learn what you've demonstrated so effectively." Through the office window, Lena could see the training ground where she had first faced Tank's dismissive skepticism. Now, that same area hosted daily sessions where soldiers of all sizes were learning that technique could overcome raw strength, that adaptation mattered more than intimidation. "There's something else," Lieutenant Shaw said, entering the office with a small delegation that included Tank, Ethan, and, surprisingly, Sergeant Hale. "The base commander wants to implement your training methods system-wide. You've changed how we think about combat effectiveness." Tank stepped forward, his expression carrying none of the condescension that had characterized their early interactions. "I wanted to thank you," he said formally, "not just for the training, but for showing all of us that being tough isn't just about being big. My whole approach to fighting has changed because of what you taught me." Ethan nodded agreement. "The tactical analysis methods you developed are being incorporated into our intelligence training. You've proven that understanding your opponent is as important as overpowering them." But it was Sergeant Hale's words that carried the most weight. "I owe you an apology," he said,
his voice carrying across the office with the same authority he had always possessed, but now tempered with genuine humility. I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment about what makes an effective soldier. You've proven that excellence comes in many forms. He extended his hand, and when Lena shook it, she could feel the sincerity behind the gesture. I'd be honored to learn from you if you're willing to teach an old dog some new tricks. Major Kincaid smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. This is what progress looks like, not just individual achievement, but institutional evolution. You've helped us redefine what we mean by strength, by toughness, by military effectiveness. As the meeting concluded and the group dispersed, Lena found herself alone with Lieutenant Shaw on the steps of the administration building. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but it no longer seemed hostile. Instead, it looked like home. "So what's next?" Shaw asked. Lena considered the question. 6 months ago, she had arrived at this base as an outsider, fighting to prove that she belonged. Now, she was being asked to help train the next generation of soldiers, to pass on the lessons she had learned through years of struggle and adaptation. "Next," she said finally, "we teach them that the strongest fighter isn't always the biggest one. We show them that technique and intelligence can overcome any physical disadvantage, and we prove that excellence has nothing to do with what people expect, and everything to do with what you're willing to become." The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the sounds of soldiers training, grunts of exertion, the impact of bodies hitting mats, the sharp commands of instructors pushing their students to exceed their own expectations. It was the sound of evolution, of an institution learning to recognize strength in forms it had never acknowledged before. Lena smiled as she listened to the familiar sounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to train, new preconceptions to overcome. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in the Nevada desert, she felt truly at home. The warrior who had been dismissed as too small, too weak, too different, had not only survived, but transformed the very definition of what it meant to be a soldier. And in doing so, she had opened doors for everyone who would follow in her footsteps. The desert had tested her, shaped her, and ultimately accepted her. Now it was time to help others find their own path through the heat and hardship to the strength that lay waiting on the other side. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.